this evening to join me for this talk on surrogacy. And it might seem strange at first that I'm devoting a whole talk on surrogacy. It's not really the first thing that comes to mind when we think of pro-life issues. Usually we think euthanasia or abortion, and certainly they're important. But as I speak to you tonight, 3 separate inquiries are being held at both state and federal level as to whether we should reduce restrictions on surrogacy that are currently in place. So we're soon going to be knee-deep in talk and debates on surrogacy. So I think it's a really important topic for us to be looking at this evening. So firstly, what is surrogacy? Surrogacy refers to a woman being commissioned to bear a child with the intention of handing that child to the care of a commissioning parent or parent once the child's born. So the woman acting as a surrogate may agree to the arrangement as an act of generosity, something that we refer to as altruistic surrogacy, or for financial payment, something that we refer to as commercial surrogacy. So the child may be conceived using the gametes of one or both of the commissioning parents, or they may have no genetic relationship to the parents at all and be the product of sort of donor sperm and donor eggs. And there are a number of people who opt for surrogacy to have children. So there are the women who, for some medical reason, are incapable of carrying a child to term. There are single men or same-sex male couples who obviously don't have a womb in which to carry the child. And from time to time, there are also the women for whom pregnancy is too inconvenient for work or for their body, like the Hollywood stars who don't want to carry a baby to term so that then they can continue with their Hollywood career. Think Khloe Kardashian or Nicole Kidman or people like that. So currently in New South Wales, surrogacy is only permitted for altruistic purposes. In other words, a surrogate mother may be paid for her expenses, including her medical expenses, her travel, and up to about 2 months away from work. But no other payment is permitted to be made to the mother. And this is the law regardless of whether the mother is living in Australia or whether she's living overseas. And while New South Wales can't stop what's happening overseas, it can decide whether or not a child born to a surrogate overseas is issued with a New South Wales birth certificate, and not listing the surrogate mother as the mother of the child, but as the commissioning parents. Other states, South Australia, for example, don't allow commercial surrogacy in South Australia, but they allow it if the parents go overseas and commission a surrogate over there. And they're happy then to register the child as if it was an Australian citizen born of the Australian commissioning parents. And so this is what has led to what we call reproductive tourism, where people pay women in other countries to be surrogate mothers. In countries like the US and Canada, Australians will pay tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars for surrogacy arrangements. But in poorer countries like the Ukraine, like Georgia, Mexico and Colombia, surrogacy costs are much lower. And now this isn't an uncommon practice. There are about 4 babies each week born to overseas surrogates for Australian parents. And Australia is the highest user of surrogacy services overseas per capita. We're the 3rd largest by raw numbers in the world and the highest per capita. So in New South Wales, the Department of Communities Justice and the New South Wales Parliament are both conducting inquiries as to whether to loosen the restrictions on commercial surrogacy, and so is the Australian Law Reform Commission at a federal level. So for the time we have together this evening, what I'd really like to do is to outline some of the problems with surrogacy. And the first and the most obvious is that as Catholics, we all have the same moral objections to surrogacy as we do to IVF. The creation of embryos used for surrogacy, as for IVF, occurs outside the marital act and separates the procreative act from the unitive act. It also often leads to the creation and discarding of a number of human embryos, which we know are individual, unrepeatable human beings who should be given a chance at life and who aren't. But then there are some moral issues for surrogacy in particular. The first thing is that a child has the right, wherever possible, to know and be raised by its biological mother and father. But surrogacy has as its intention that something other than that will happen. That is, the child is not intended to know its birth mother. And in some cases, it's not intended to know its biological mother either. There's also a very cruel separation of the mother and child at birth. One of the things I'd like to do tonight is show you 3 quick videos to illustrate what I'm talking about. And here's the first, if it works, and it's capturing the moment when a baby is just being born.
So we arrived early at this maternity clinic in Tbilisi. Suddenly, we're told the baby is coming. This is Jean the second time as a surrogate, this time for a couple in China. As a divorced single mom, she needs the money to buy a home for herself and her 2 children. After around 20 minutes, the baby is nearly out. Jean and the baby are separated immediately. Surrogates aren't allowed to touch the child they've just given birth to. It's strange now it's all over. Such an intense experience watching that baby being born. Usually the baby would be put straight onto the mother's chest, but obviously the surrogate isn't able to touch the baby they've just given birth to. In this case, the baby's intended parents are still in China, and so the baby's just being put straight into the cot and hasn't had anyone cuddling yet. It feels really weird, you just kind of want to go and pick him up.
Did you notice the child left alone and uncomforted? The story goes on to say that the child's left there for weeks until the proper visa arrangements can be made in China. Interestingly, the law here in New South Wales says that a pup is not allowed to be separated from its mother for 8 weeks because of the distress it will cause to both mother and puppy. But we allow this for children. Some of you may remember this scene here. It's the recent case of Sam Jones, an American social media influencer who was criticised for picking up a baby wombat while she was in Australia. There were questions about whether or not she'd breached her visa conditions and should be deported because of the cruel, if very brief, separation of mother and baby wombat. But we're currently looking to expand our laws on surrogacy. Did you also notice the mother? She said that she'd psychologically prepared for that moment, but did anyone believe that to be true looking at her? Because one of the other issues with surrogacy is that it takes a dualistic approach to motherhood and to being a woman. As Catholics, we know that every human being is a unity of body and soul. We believe that our bodies and our souls are united in a way that cannot be separated. It's a different talk, but that's why we have a problem with gender ideology. But Surrogacy says something different. Surrogacy functionalises pregnancy and ignores the feelings that a mother has for a baby she's carried and given birth to. It denies the truth that pregnancy is something a woman experiences as a person, and instead tries to say that it's only something that happens to her body and not to her soul. That you can carry and give birth to a baby without becoming a mother. And any woman in this room who's given birth to a child knows that that's false, right? The body and the person are one and can't be separated. Women are not separate from our wombs. In fact, surrogacy separates motherhood into three parts, because you've got the biological mother who may provide the donor egg, you've got the mother who carries the child, and you've got the commissioning mother. And look, we know that sometimes, tragically, these roles are separated either because of illness or death or family breakdown or something else. But in those circumstances, it's rightly viewed as a tragedy, and women and children are supported in grieving the loss of a connection between mother and child. But it's not the case here, because surrogacy is pitched as something good and something that's valuable. Surrogacy clinics teach women to cut emotional bonds with the children that they're carrying. Surrogate mothers are told never to say "my child," to never refer to themselves as a mother, and to talk to the child about its commissioning parents. They don't even like calling a woman a surrogate mother anymore. It's shortened to surrogate, or they call the woman the gestational carrier. Next video.
I've come to meet Nina, who's 39 and 8 months pregnant with her second surrogacy. Last time she had twins.
ეს ჩემი წამლებია. ამას უკეთებ მუცელში ნემსი არის. ამას ეს არის წამალი ნიმის რა ქვია. ეს არის კიდე კარდიომაგნიტულის მუცელში. taxipari.
Is that every day?
Yeah.
As she has 5 children of her own, this will be the 8th baby she's given birth to.
Yeah. Incis percemetrova და გოკაკი მადებს თავს ხშირად და მეფერება ეს
She says she became a surrogate to provide for her children after leaving her abusive husband.
ეს რვანაკერი, რომელიც არის მისგან მიყენებული შუშისგან და ძალიან ცუდად ეს პერიოდი.
How did it feel when you had somebody else's child in you and you had to give it away at the end of those 9 months?
გრძნობა ის აცდედაგანი შვილად ცდილობს გრძნობაში და მაგრამ ხორი მომზადებული ორგანიზმი ხორიცის და ხორიცის რასხვისი შვილია ეს არა და მაგრამ ფსიქოლოგიურად ძალიან ძლიერი უნდა იყო განცდები არ ვიცი არ ვიცი თუმცა ვერ უნდა ვიმუშაო რომ ეს ისე არ არის მოდრონე წინასწარ არ ვიცი მაგრამ მე მეგონა პირველადაც რომ ესე ვიყავი რომ ადვილად დავთხოვდი არა მე გადავიტადი ამ ყველაფერს მაგრამ ძალიან გამიჭირდა და
For anyone who's read or watched it, this is the horror of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, where young, fertile women are used to give birth to the children of wealthy families when their wives have been rendered infertile. But ironically, in that story, in The Handmaid's Tale, it's the religious people who think that this is a good idea, when in reality it's the opposite. We're the ones fighting for the dignity of women, not the other way around. I digress. The issues I've mentioned relate to all forms of surrogacy, whether that's altruistic or commercial. But there are also some very specific issues when it comes to Australians entering into commercial surrogacy arrangements overseas. And the first is the potential for the exploitation of women, particularly for poor women. I'm not sure if any of you remember the saga of baby Gammy. It's now going back about 10, 11 years. It was 2014. So what happened in that case was an Australian couple entered into a commercial arrangement with a 21-year-old Thai woman, and she became pregnant with twins. 4 months into that pregnancy, one of the twins was diagnosed with Down syndrome. The Australian couple took the healthy baby girl that was born, but left the boy, baby Gammy, behind in Thailand and paid the mother about $11,000 for the healthy baby girl. And at the time, the law in Thailand was that only single women who had already had children were allowed to be surrogate mothers, because otherwise under Thai law, the fathers would her husband would automatically become the father of the child. So this 21-year-old woman was already a single mother and was now left raising a child with special needs. She'd said the only reason she agreed to the surrogacy arrangement in the first place was so that she could pay her bills. Now, there was some dispute at the time and in subsequent years about whether Gammy's mother insisted on keeping him or whether the Australian couple rejected him, but that actually wasn't the only or even the main controversy in this case. Another controversy was that the commissioning father, David Farnell, had been convicted of 22 child sex offences against 3 young girls between the ages of 5 and 12, and Farnell spent about 2 years in prison as a result. But there are no criminal background checks on surrogates to see if they can have access to kids. After this case, commercial surrogacy was restricted in Thailand and also in India, which was another huge source of babies for Australians. But this wasn't the only such case. There were other babies left behind by Australians because of other illnesses or even because they were the wrong sex. And an added problem in these cases comes from the fact that the citizenship of these abandoned babies is then placed in doubt. Some countries, like the Ukraine, don't recognise the biological children of citizens of other countries like Australia as citizens, even if they're born to a Ukrainian surrogate. So if the child's abandoned, they're not seen as a citizen of that country and not entitled to some of the social security benefits that the child would have. But without a request from the commissioning parents to bring that child to Australia, Australia doesn't recognise them as citizens either, and the children become stateless. In Australia today, the main country for surrogate children is the USA, but that can cost up to $200,000 per child. So other poorer countries like the Ukraine make up a lot of the Australian surrogacy market. And everyone for years has been worried about the plight of the people in the Ukraine, and rightly so. But even prior to the war breaking out, more than a third of Ukrainians were living below the poverty line, and Ukrainian women were highly susceptible to exploitation with surrogacy. But no one was championing their cause. We're also hearing that there are more and more children being born in Kenya because they have no regulation at all over there. Surrogacy is very dangerous for women, particularly in developing countries with no regulation, because it places pressure on women to bring themselves out of poverty by renting out their wombs. Surrogacy is already a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it can't be used as a solution to poverty. We all need to take responsibility to address the real causes of poverty. My last video.
More and more women at the shelter are becoming surrogate mothers, especially after the impact COVID is having on jobs. For women like Alessia, the money is the difference between being homeless and having a roof over her head.
I wondered how you found out about surrogacy, to really approach you and ask you if you wanted to do it.
ხალისგან გავიგე, ადრე იყო, გასული იყო, მაგრამ მოვიდა და გავიგე ამასთან და მოვიდა და გავიგე ამის შესახებ. მითხრა რატო წვალობო, ყოველდღე აქ წვალობდი და რაღაცა არ გამოვიდეს, მუშაობდია, დღეში მქონდა 10 ლარი ხელფასი, 10 ლარი არ მყოფდა არანაირად და შემოთავაზა ეს.
Did the agency encourage you to bring in more women? Did they give you the money to bring people?
მე თუ წავიყვანე, თქვა, მე როგორც წავიყვანე ეს მიიღე $400, მე თუ წავიყვანე მარიამი, მივიღე $400.
Later in this piece, this poor woman at 3 months pregnant has said she's already signed up to be a surrogate for a second time because £10,000 isn't enough to get her out of the shelter and into a home. Surely we can do better than that for the poor. Another problem we see in this is the potential for human trafficking, because some women are trafficked into surrogacy in the same way that they're trafficked into prostitution. There have been stories of women being brought into countries with the promise of legitimate work, only to be placed in prison-like accommodation, forcibly impregnated by underworld medical practitioners and monitored until the baby is born. The EU has recognised as forced surrogacy as a form of human trafficking. And I think there was a surrogacy clinic in Greece that at the time had 49 babies born to Australian couples, all by trafficked women. The former Chief Justice of the Family Court, John Pascoe, called international surrogacy the new frontline in trafficking and commodification of women and newborn children. And he said that international surrogacy is being used by people ill-suited to be parents, driven by cash and no oversight by any regulating body, and likely to expose vulnerable women and children to terrible abuse. This is the Chief Justice of the Family Court in Australia. Strangely, though, the Chief Justice thinks that this can be fixed by legalising commercial surrogacy here in Australia, and we hear this argument often. Australians are going to engage surrogate parents overseas, whether we like it or not, but they're at risk of exploitation, so why not allow it here, because then we can regulate it. The solution to all these problems overseas, they say, is simply to have commercial surrogacy here in Australia, and that's part of the push we're having right at the moment. But I want to propose to you this evening that there's also there are also issues with allowing commercial surrogacy here in Australia. The first, obviously, is the commodification of children. If you can enter into a contract for the bearing of a child, then we slowly move into a mentality that they're just another product bought and paid for. And what happens when we buy a product? We want to make sure that we get the quality that we've paid for. So what happens if the child conceived is diagnosed before birth with some type of abnormality, as baby Gammy was? Will the surrogate mother in Australia be contractually required to terminate the pregnancy? This is unlikely. I can't imagine a law in Australia forcing an abortion on a mother. But if she doesn't abort the child, what happens to the baby? Are the commissioning parents required to keep the child even if they don't want it? Is the baby put up for adoption? Does it go into state care as a foster child and get bounced around the foster system? What happens if the baby is born with some type of medical condition that's not diagnosed in the womb? Can the surrogate mother be sued for delivering a faulty product? What if she was a smoker? What if she was a drinker? What if she didn't exercise enough during pregnancy? What if she exercised too much during pregnancy? Are we introducing a mentality where babies are judged on their quality and a value placed on them accordingly? Would a surrogacy contract here in Australia include details of what a surrogate mother is allowed to eat or drink, if she can smoke or play sport? How many hours is she allowed to work, and how much stress should her job entail? How much control should intending parents have over a woman for the 9 months, and should the price increase for every additional control they have? For example, if they prefer she didn't work, they'd have to pay more. If they wanted to ensure she ate only a certain number of calories in a day to avoid gestational diabetes, would they put that in the contract, and would it cost more if she was just allowed to eat what she wanted? Should they be able to bind her to take vitamin supplements or something else, and would that come at a higher price? And if so, how are these pay per control surrogacy contracts really any different to modern slavery? What happens if she breaches her contractual obligations? Could she be sued? Australia has already seen many cases of doctors being sued for implanting faulty IVF embryos or failing to diagnose a medical condition, and parents claiming the cost of raising the child into adulthood. Could a surrogate mother be sued in the same way? If a baby's born with a medical condition, would the 9 months she spent carrying the child be analysed to see if she was to blame? Could she be risking being sued for more money than she's earning by becoming a surrogate? What about other contractual obligations with the parents? You have the commissioning parents, those who ultimately want the child. They may or may not be the biological parents of the child, or they may use a donor sperm and a donor egg. That makes 4 parents, and then there's a surrogate mother. So that's 5 biological parents of the child. Surrogacy contracts would have to regulate the relationship amongst all of the parents, but what about when those relationships break down? What happens, for example, if the commissioning parents split up before the baby's born and they decide they no longer want the child? What then? And what about the doctors? A doctor is obliged to act in the best interests of their patient, in this case the mother and the child she's carrying. But how is this affected when the legal guardian of the child is not the mother who's bringing the child to term, or the person paying for the medical care is someone other than the mother who's sitting in front of them? Does that complicate the doctor-patient relationship? Should a doctor be required to breach doctor-patient confidentiality in these circumstances and disclose otherwise private medical information to those paying for the baby? And what about other relationships? In these discussions, no one ever asks about the family of the surrogate mother. If she's married, how does her husband feel about the arrangement? And what about her children? And how will they be affected by seeing their mother pregnant and then being deprived of someone they thought they might be a sibling? And these are all issues that will arise, even if surrogacy is legalised here in Australia. Commercial surrogacy will not stop the exploitation of women, because even if someone is entering into an arrangement freely, there are still so many possibilities for coercion or emotional manipulation. Women who are desperate will often do things that they don't want to do just to get by. And that's why so many fall prey to prostitution, to pornography, and to other attacks on their dignity. We mustn't give it the legal imprimatur. And we can't pretend that human trafficking isn't a problem also here in Australia, and that a commercial surrogacy market will just fix that. There are so many unanswered questions about surrogacy, and unfortunately the push for legalisation of surrogacy doesn't engage with any of them. It just puts a same-sex male couple on the front page of a paper and tells a story about how much they love their child. Of course, our heart breaks for couples who find themselves infertile and who desperately want children, but this isn't the way to go about it. Women deserve better, children deserve better, and we can aspire as a community to be better. That's all I've got. Thank you. Thank you for having me tonight.